That's okay.
All right, welcome everybody. I'm going to really introduce you to the microbiome. Those of you that are familiar with it, I'm going to cover some things, hopefully get you excited about aspects of the microbiome that are new, that keep emerging out of our world. And furthermore, I'm going to take you down two little journeys, two little stories about how we got here and why we got here. And I'm going to ask you all, because there are some people stuck in Denver apparently, that I want you to share my story today with them, those when you are at breaks tomorrow as they arrive, so that you can catch them up. We want to get them as excited about this process as that I'm going to be getting you excited about. And I expect excitement, no dozing, no nodding. If this were a college lecture, I would have a little ball I could throw at you and wake you up. That's still legal. You can't paddle, but you can wake people up in the classroom. They're paying for it, so it's a little more liberal that way. I want to start off by saying the microbiome is a new paradigm, although the science and the history of it all, the gut instinct, the gut-brain connection, you look back in TCM and other Ayurveda, we've always known, in fact, Hippocrates made a quote that the gut is somehow responsible for our emotions, right? And one of the things this weekend that I want to really bring home, I'm going to bring you a lot of science tomorrow, but I want to marry two concepts to the microbiota and to your body. There's the psychobiome, right? And that's how these influences of the bacteria, the fungus, and the virus, and so on, influence your mind, your emotional state, the state of your well-being. That's psychological. That's all of the emotional part of who you are, as well as the neuro. The neuro is the actual physiology and biology of the neurosystem. There's the neuroendocrine system. There's the central nervous system, which is sympathetic, parasympathetic. And there are things like the immunoneurosystem, right? There's the immunological piece to your neurology. They're both very much interlinked, but we can think about them separately. If someone is anxiety and stress and depression, that's the psychology of what's happening. The neurological piece, it's married to it, and we're going to cover both, right? When I speak to one or the other, they really are interlinked, and we experience them through the mind and the emotion, but the body is experiencing it through the neurological processes. Does that make sense? So we use those terms interchangeably, but they both have very powerful meanings together. That being said, what is the microbiome? Well, the microbiome is a complex, very complex system of organisms, very, very, very small organisms. They can be, the vast majority of them are phage or viruses, which we don't want to talk about today because we understand so little about the viral component of our microbiome. It's a growing field. Those of you that are familiar with our phage products have already experienced part of the viral microbiome, right? The SL, or the SAL, the ECO, and the pseudo. And soon, there'll be a new one for you called P. acnes, right? Or Propionibacterium acnes. Topical. These are all individual viruses that we have a relationship with. The next group is called the bacteria. That's the microbiome of the bacterial world. We also have a fungal microbiome called the mycobiome. And those of you that have ever experienced a yeast infection or candida in the GI, those are myco. Those are all the fungal world. And mold happens to be one of those as well. And then we have, of course, small parasites, or the parasitic world. I call it the parasitome, but I don't think that's really even a name. But I had to name something because there isn't one for it, right? No one's studying that, by the way. That's very, very limited. And as I go down there, the bacteria is the most well-studied, the viral is the next, and then the fungal, and then the parasitic world that we enjoy as part of our lives. There is the commensals, that means sitting at the same table in Latin. Those are things that are part of you. They may be beneficial, they may just be along for the ride, or they may be symbiotic, not just beneficial, but they get something and you get something, right? There's a symbiosis there. Those are called commensals. There's pathobionts, those are pathogens. We're all extremely aware of pathogens. We're not going to talk about those in too much detail today or tomorrow. And then, of course, there are all the unknowns that we have. There's over 1,000 species of organism that live inside your GI tract. there are more bacterial cells on you and in you than there are in your own body. About 10 times more. Okay, you have about 3 billion cells in you, and you have over 30 billion bacterial cells on and in you. You have about 20 to 30, let's be conservative, let's go 30 to 40 genes in your body. And genes make you who you are, right? You've heard of genetic testing. You've heard of genetic makeup. Your genetic DNA is who you are. That was given to you by your mom and dad. And we've known this for a very long time, right? Genetics has been around for quite some time. And it's become so much well-known, it's now personalized. So you can actually get your own DNA testing if you'd like and understand your own genetics. But that's only been part of the story. Once we had in the early 2000s, when we had our entire genome mapped, and we noticed that there were only 20 to 30,000 genes that were expressed as you, okay? And those 20 to 30,000 genes, many of them are dedicated to making your hair color, your eye color, your protein makeup, your skin color, your digestive tract, making the tissues that you are, right? Most of those genes are dedicated to making you. And there's a few that are dedicated to your immune system. There's some that are dedicated to other functions that change a little bit. But I can promise you, of those 30,000 to 40,000 genes, they're not very flexible, right? It's hard to change your genetic environment. There's some epigenetics that we won't talk about, but that's the only way to do it. When you're given your genetics, that's what you're given, right? It's almost impossible to change your hair color without a dye. It's impossible to change your eye color without contacts. It's impossible to change your height without doing something like taking growth hormone or who knows. But these are your genetics, and most of your genetics are dictated by those phenomenon, who we are. That isn't very flexible. That isn't very plastic, so to speak. Like, plasticity is limited in our own genetics. Well, the world knew that early on. The world knew that you were going to be exposed to a dynamic environment. You're being exposed to your social networks. You're being exposed to the environment. You're being exposed to animals and sea life and water and earth and fruit and vegetables and pets and all these things. You're being exposed to literally hundreds of thousands of different living organisms on a regular basis. So early on, in its brilliant wisdom, and those of you that have heard me talk about the cell, and inside the cell, it's really amazing how we have the nucleus and the ribosomes and all that really cool stuff, which we still embrace, by the way. But how does that cell now have a relationship? Because the cell's not as plastic as the world needs it to be. How does that cell then live so harmoniously and vitally with the world around you? Because it's really fraught with a lot of changes and threats, so to speak. In comes the microbiome. You have 30 to 40,000 genes. The microbiome brings you 300,000 genes to 3 million genes, depending on how diverse you are. What do all those genes allow you to do? They allow your body, these microorganisms that live in you and on you, allow your skin to adapt to sun. They allow you to handle a certain amount of toxins in the air. If you live on an island, your chances are you've probably experienced some volcanic eruption, or you're living on soil that's volcanic. So you have to be able to adapt to these things. Your GI tract needs thousands of genes, because when you take a drink of water or a bite, or you kiss somebody, or you maul your granddaughter, you're experiencing all sorts of new microbes all the time. You go and pick a fruit out of the garden, you're now exposed to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of new bugs that you've never experienced before. How do you go as an explorer from Europe to North America, never been here before, and you adapt and you survive? That's the microbiome. You can't adapt by yourself quickly enough. The microbiome's genes allow you to do that. They make thousands of enzymes, they make thousands of different things for you to live and adapt well. Right? If you're living in the north, on the north pole regions, high Alaska, Siberia, and you have very little sunlight and very little vitamin D production, you have microbiome that do that for you. Okay? That's the brilliance of the microbiome. It allows you to be so much more diverse than you otherwise would have been. So that's the bugs. So let's talk about the history and why we're here today and why we're all of a sudden interested in this concept. Because what I'm telling you now is really in retrospect, we're really looking back for what we know now back into time. So beginning in the 1600s, You have a scientist by the name of Van Leeuwenhoek. And he takes, and we now have microscopes, really crude microscopes. And Van Leeuwenhoek takes water and spit. He takes his own spit. And he's got this way of, now that he's got a microscope, he's looking at all these little bugs in there. So he essentially is the discoverer of microbiome, or the microbes. And he does use the body, and he uses water sources and other things to look at these guys in the microscope. Now, at that point in time, it was just a mere exciting thing. It's like looking at a rainbow. No idea really what it meant, but he discovered them, and it was really cool. So he's now the discoverer of the microbiota in the world around us, whether it be from soil or your own body. 200 years go by, and we get into the 1800s, and now what we have is Koch and Pastore. They discover that microbes are pathogenic. So a lot of the microbes that are responsible for the deaths, the plagues, and everything that was going on earlier are very dangerous. So that in comes the pathogenic philosophy towards our bugs. Okay? Because soon after that, we get into the later 1900s. What's the first thing we do when we discover penicillin, right? We start to eradicate bugs, because starting with Koch and Pastore, we start looking at these microbes as problematic. And one of the reasons that they believe that is newborn animals didn't show very much microbial life with the tech tools they had. And so they thought, well, microbes that are now on us must be dangerous, so let's start killing them, right? That's the kill philosophy that we've had for over 150 years. That started then. At the same time, you have a gentleman by the name of Bisset, and he discovers in the 1800s the brain-gut connection anatomically. So there's always been, in ancient medicines, there's been referrals to the gut-brain connection, but anatomically, he's dissecting humans now. He's a French researcher, and he shows that the gut is a second brain. So he coins the term second brain. He noticed that it's not like the first brain, which is really, really dense nervous system. It's a much more diffuse, double-layered nervous system throughout the GI, and it has its own spinal cord, right? What do we call that now? What do we call the second spinal cord? I know that's probably a bad way to put it. That's the vagal nerve. So he identifies that this brain, it has a giant conduit to the brain, to the first brain. So he says, look, we now have this amazing amount of neurological information distributed throughout the gut, second brain. Didn't know what it meant exactly, but that was our first lesson to where we are now. Simultaneously, you have some scientists looking again at newborns, and they're saying, okay, why is it that newborns that are not breastfed, again, this was in Europe, and this is a scientist by the name, actually a doctor by the name of Tissier, and he's looking at newborns saying, why? First of all, now where they're looking at microscopes, they have microscopes, we know there are bacteria, and we're watching newborns, and he's watching the feces of newborns, and he discovers in healthy newborns, being breastfed, he discovers a Y-shaped organism. And those of you that love the microbiome and bacteria, like I do, like they're my second kids, it looked like that. And he kept seeing these under the microscope, and he called them Bifidobacterium. Have you guys heard of that? Bifidobacterium were discovered in infants. And what he found is that when they were being breastfed in Europe, they had a 7 times increased chance of survival over non-breastfed babies. So now we're starting to make these loose connections between the bacteria and our health. It used to be that they were all dangerous. And that continues, by the way. That philosophy still continues up until present. But there are little places in history that show us that wasn't always the case. And if we would have listened, we would be better off than we are now. So we have Bifidobacterium come into play. Also, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, you have a scientist by the name of Shayne who starts using what we call, he's the first person to create germ-free animals. Have you guys heard that term? All right, so germ-free animals, they give birth in the laboratory under specialized conditions to animals that have 0 microbiota. 0. And you ask yourself, why are they doing that? Well, back then, they were trying to understand the influence of the microbiota. So these are the first people that started to look at the true influences of having one or not. And tomorrow, what I'll get into in more depth is, and in my second story, we'll get into it a little bit, and I'll try to speed it up, is when they started giving birth to these germ-free animals and watching them grow and develop, there were all these shortcomings. Neurological inhibition, anxiety, depression, stress behaviors, autistic behaviors. Some of them got MS, some of them got Parkinson's. They were noticing this without knowing what they were actually looking at back then. So we're talking the early 1900s. They were looking at these germ-free animals. This was later picked back up during the microbiome, and we'll get there in a second. This really started to create this path that we can feel good about because it's not something that we're just making up. There's a lot of history here now, looking backwards. So we go from germ-free animals, and then we jump to 2007. In 2007, we start a project called the Microbiome, Human Microbiome Project. Not any different than, do you guys remember the human sequencing project? And that finished, I believe, in 2000. But the Human Microbiome Project started in 2007. That's when I started talking about it from stage. Because there's a number of early studies, and then we take into consideration all this past that I've just referred to, we start saying, wait a second. We're no longer just human cells. The greater picture shows us so much more of our relationship with our planet and our world and our friends and our family and so on. And we'll get into more of that tomorrow. But we started to see, wait a second. And there were little things that led up to the 2007 break, but that's when all this money came in to say, what is the human microbiome? It finished in 2010. And that finishing really mapped our bodies to the extent that we could map it. And that's when you hear about the 1,000 species in your GI. You hear about the untold species on your skin, in your nose. And remember, the skin is particularly weird because species that live here are different than the species that live here, are different than the species that live here. This is like the globe, where you've got temperate rainforests, you've got deserts, you've got the oil fields of, Saudi Arabia. I mean, these are all different environments that have created a possibility for all these different bugs. Now, if you change those bugs, or if you do something to harm those bugs now, post the Human Microbiome Project, guess what we're learning? We're learning that you affect your health. There's one other thing I want to tell you before I walk you down the story of being a human, is part of what drove this is the chronic issues that we're facing. Chronic issues, not acute. We're not talking about the plague. We're not talking about smallpox. We're not talking about these acute issues that arise. We're talking about these chronic issues that are plaguing almost everyone. We don't hear about the stories. We call ourselves first world countries that seem to be focused on these chronic issues, but they exist in second, third world countries as well. They just don't get the attention that we're giving it here, right? Because we have a lot more resources, social media, and so on, where we can look at the chronic diseases that are killing us. And they're killing some people in these countries too, although it's a different story. Tomorrow we'll get into really depth of the psychobiome and the neurobiome. But today I just want to paint this picture that that's what brought us to this point. Now, since 2010, so in 2007, I kind of introduced it loosely at some of our meetings, and I didn't have a lot of science behind it because I was just getting involved in the organisms that live on us and some of the ones that we can grow and some of the ones that we already have available in probiotics and ferments and other things that became, that burgeoned into a whole new industry, has it not? It's a lot like organic. Right? Organic, 100 years ago, would be called farming. Right now, it's organic. It's like, what the heck? It's silly. But the microbiome has gone through the same thing. We've identified these guys, and now you're going to see a lot of people taking it too far. And this weekend, and tomorrow I'm going to tell you more about the future of this. We're not going to take it too far. We're going to take it just what it needs to be. Just what we need as a human population that needs to be in touch with its microbiome, in touch with its environment, in touch with its social structure, its friends and family. It's all part and parcel to this mental health. So that being said, the really quick story I want to tell you is the human. So the story I told you about the development of the microbiome science, how we got to where we are, is the one story. The other story is let's take a journey through being a human. So we all know how we're conceived. I don't have to describe that. Well, there's no one in the audience that needs to hear that anyway. On how we're made, because that's fun, but it's also not necessary. But the process begins that early. So let's talk about the microbiome. You as an adult that is fertile, you have a microbiome in every part of your body, and especially in the reproductive areas of your body, both men and women. In fact, just to tell you, there's microbiomes in the semen, and there's microbiomes throughout the vaginal tract, uterus, and so on. We're not as sterile as we used to think we are. And the first thing that happens, of course, when you fertilize an egg, it takes a journey down and then implants, right? And now I'm not going to go into detail, but what does that do to hormones? It changes the hormones, doesn't it? Distinctly changes them. And simultaneous to that event, in order for that event to happen, and this is science we're going to get to later, not this weekend, but I want to prime you guys for the next 2 years. You must keep coming to these for the next 2 years, because in the female journey, I'm going to tell you that your microbiome has to be compatible with your partner in order for fertilization to happen. Not just genetically compatible, not just emotionally compatible and spiritually compatible, but microbiome has to be compatible. I'm not going to tell you how, because that's for later, but it's true. Okay? So first and foremost, you have to have a compatible microbiome in order to have successful fertilization and growth of that little baby. Second piece, now it implants and it starts to grow. A lot of things happen in your body. Hormones start changing. I mean, I can't tell the women. I'm speaking just from not experience, but from my wife's experience and stories and so on. A lot of things start to happen now. The vaginal world and the uterus change dramatically in terms of their hormone output, their estrogen, and so does the microbiome. Okay? The microbiome changes dramatically. The lactobacillus grow rapidly in that area because they drop the pH. They want to make it a protective environment. Dropping the pH down to a low pH prevents pathogen growth. E. coli, salmonella, all the things that could get up there, and yeast even. So now we change the microbiome while we're growing this baby to protect the baby, by the way. Those microbiome are protecting your baby, which is phenomenal. Simultaneously, we need to, again, this is for the women's side, so I'm going to tell you this again. You're going to get some stories over the next 2 years. I'm going to tell you a little today, and I'll elaborate later. But the other thing that starts to happen dramatically is the placenta. The placenta gets colonized by oral bacteria. So the first thing you tell your pregnant moms, take care of your oral microbiome immediately. Because when we look at placenta from a microbial standpoint, it matches the mouth almost exactly. It's not sterile, by the way. The placenta has its own microbiome right out of the gate, okay, as soon as it develops. Now, as we continue to develop in the mom, as we get closer to birth, we do think, this is new science, but we think there's a lot of microbiome already in the baby at this point. So we used to think of babies as sterile. There's some evidence that that's not true. Now the question is, what organisms are they? And the ones that they're finding, they're trying to differentiate to make sure they're not just pathogens that made it through the embryonic system. That's still being done. Research is still ongoing. But what is known, of course, the placenta piece. And at the same time, right when the baby's getting ready to be born, your immune system, now this is cool, and again, I'll go into this in more detail. Your immune system reaches into your GI tract, grabs your commensal bacteria, carries them to the breast tissue, and pushes them into the milk ducts. How cool is that? So when you're breastfeeding your baby, you're now giving them live bugs from your gut via dendritic cells. We've always wondered how they did it. Someone just discovered how that happens. Again, that's for the female in a few seminars from now. So you have to come. And you got to tell people to come with you, because this is unprecedented research that we'll be presenting you. Now you're born. As a toddler, you start growing. And you start experiencing, after you're done breastfeeding, the microbiome changes again dramatically. As soon as you start solid foods, and the microbiome, by the way, triggers through the vagal nerve the weaning mechanism. So that's why different babies wean at different times, because part of it, the microbiome's not ready, so you need to listen to nature. Other times, if you do it too soon, you can disrupt the microbiome. You can create systems of dysbiosis, which we'll get in later. But when you wean a baby, they're ready. That means their microbiome's ready to start metabolizing solid foods. Remember we talked about the thousands of genes that your microbiome gives you? They need to be there in order for the benefit from the food to come. Otherwise, breast milk is the thing that's keeping your baby's microbiome happy, as well as the other nutrients. But the microbiome is critical in this process. Once they're ready, the microbiome helps trigger that weaning, right? So people that just are too lazy to do it any other way, not to be mean to them, because I know it's difficult, even if you pump and use that milk, please, because it is a process, and that process is so phenomenally important for the development of the microbiome. Simultaneous to this, and we'll touch on this a little bit tomorrow, the brain develops alongside the microbiome. And the triggers that keep those guys in sync are real. They're real neurotransmitters. There's real communication in the vagal nerve, and there's real communication with the immune system. Both systems grow simultaneously. If you take an animal, and this is preclinical, but you take any other animal, and if they sever the vagal nerve, which you can do, and that doesn't kill an animal, the brain stops developing, because now the gut is no longer telling the brain to develop. If you give them antibiotics when they're little, the brain stops developing during the antibiotic period, and you have to recover that. Among other things, the other tissues are developing simultaneously. So the microbiome is intimately connected to development for those little people. Now we enter into teenage years, right? Real quick. Teenage years. What a mess, right? Hormones go out of control. Microbiome. The worst thing about the teenage years, and I struggled with this as much as you guys, and I wish I knew now when I had teenagers, is giving them proper fiber, if nothing else. Because top ramen, pizza, popcorn, Coke destroys the microbiome. And it leads to, by the way, and we'll get into this a little bit again tomorrow, and if I don't bring up teenagers, remind me, but it leads to depression, anxiety, stress hormones out of control, along with their testosterone, their estrogen. All these developments happening during the teenage years can destroy the brain's synapses. Because remember, the brain may have its mass, but it's still plastic. It's still developing up until they're in their 20s. And that is being directed a lot by here, much of it. So when we disrupt that through poor diet, and you add to that being in high school, the anxieties and things, you're going to get young men and women that are so distressed, so distraught, they do things that are completely unpredictable. And it isn't their fault at that moment. It is not their fault. And it's a combination of things. So keep that in mind when you're treating teenagers or moms that are going to be having a teenager soon. That has to be dealt with. I don't know about you guys, but the teenager world right now is out of control. Then add to that social media and bullying, right? There's another article, I didn't have it on my slides, but those of you that are interested, there's an article on bullying, and they tracked the GI microbiome with kids that were bullied, and it's different. When you bully a child, the microbiome is different. It's a revelation for us scientists. We don't know what it means exactly, but we do know, as Nicole mentioned briefly, the microbiome really does produce a ton of neurotransmitters. We didn't realize it did. And we didn't know how they got to the brain. They're getting there through immune system, and they're getting there through the microglial cells tomorrow, and the vagal nerve. Dopamine, epinephrine, serotonin, and so on. So all that being said, the teenage years are tough, and we need to deal with that as well. Then we get into the adult years. Now we're starting to gain diversity, and we'll talk about this tomorrow. Diversity is king, except for a few extreme circumstances, but on the biggest part, diversity is king. As we age, our diversity starts to leave us. When we measure, getting into the older population, their diversity decreases quite a bit, which coincides with issues like dementia, Parkinson's, MS. There's a diversity correlation there. And if you even go younger and look at the diversity dysbiosis and things we'll talk about later, those are the same statistics, okay? When we find a population, there's a population in Italy that they're all above 70 and they have a high diverse microbiome. Their microbiome measured just like 30-year-olds. And they couldn't find a single person in that town that had cognitive issues. So it's really, these correlations are starting to really build. The science, the fun in this is really building. And then finally, you go to your grave and you ask yourself, well, what does that have to do with microbiome? What I can tell you is that the divine, amazing piece to this is that there are microbiome organisms that die with you. They stay in your body like your friend from birth to death, and they never leave you. They have no other place to go. They can't live outside of you. They are now bonded to you. And the only way those get moved on is through the moms, by the way. It's a pretty amazing thing that the organisms that move to the next person, the baby, come from mom for the most part, and they continue. So you can almost do the genealogy through microorganisms like you can through DNA. So these guys are here for a reason. They're amazing, and they're going to help the way we think about health in our world, and especially our social health and our emotional well-being, which is what this weekend's about. Emotional well-being for all ages, and as it relates to, and tomorrow I'm going to get into herbs and nutrition as they relate, but I hope you guys see that this is an exciting, exciting new frontier for this project. It's exciting for all of us. It changes the way we think of herbs. It changes the way you should think of nutrition. It changes the way you think of interacting with your patients of all ages. Because remember, emotions work both directions. Depressed people have poor gut microbiomes, and that works both ways. And so you can control so much through really, really proactive thinking in this world. So I'm excited to bring this to you this weekend, and I'm excited for all the speakers, but I want you guys to realize that it is cutting edge, and every time we meet on the microbiome and other aspects, we're going to tie it back into the herbs and the nutrition together, because the microbiome is the first the first things that see it all, right? They transform the way herbs enter your body. They transform the way nutrients enter your body. Nothing goes through and into you without first going through the microbiome in any way, shape, or form. Your eyes, your ears, your nose. Now, sound and lights and touch, that's different. But anything that, any real material has to go through the microbiome before it gets into you. So your microbiome are the sentinels, the vanguard of how you feel. And that's it for me.